Welcome. Thank you for coming to this traditional pre-session briefing. Appreciate the journalists, especially appreciate the leaders being here. And one may not be a leader, he may be a speaker, but thank you for coming. We're going to ask a bunch of questions today, take 60 to 90 minutes, and we've asked each of the esteemed leaders to stick around for 90 minutes in case if we end this after an hour, people come up and ask you one-on-one questions afterwards. The reporters, you're welcome to ask whatever questions you want. They may not think so, but it's open for any topic. I think, and I should tell you, usually we have 5 people at that table, but Governor Dayton, as you know, had surgery recently. He could not make it. We offered several times to let him call in, and he declined that. So I guess that you guys will, if you can't talk for him, we'll have to ask him questions separately. Let me start just by asking a simple question. I'd like to ask each of you to give us the top 3 priorities you have for the upcoming session, which starts next week. And a lot of times we start with the majority party, but I'm going to start with the minority party this time. Let's start with the most rookie of them, House Minority Leader Daudt. Would you start? What would your top 3 specific priorities be?
Sure. Our priorities are really to go back and maybe this fits with the unsession theme as well, but to go back and fix some of the mistakes of the last session. So specifically repealing the 3 business-to-business taxes, federal conformity in the tax code, and then also repealing the gift tax, and then federal conformity on the estate tax as well. Those would be our priorities.
And Senate Minority Leader Hann.
Well, I think surprisingly, our priorities are very similar to the House. We think that the business-to-business taxes should be repealed, all 3 of them. We also think that federal conformity is another top priority. But we would say, too, that we think there ought to be some attention given to the MNsure structure, and we hope that we can have some opportunity to try to do something to make that work better.
Speaker Thissen.
Minimum wage, robust bonding bill, and doing some of the tax changes that Representative Daudt was talking about.
Leader Bakk.
Speaker and I did not rehearse this, but I agree we need to find an agreement on a minimum wage, a bonding bill that includes some cash rather than all borrowing like the governor proposed, and third, to make sure that the 4 leaders sitting at this table a year from now have a structurally balanced budget to deal with so that we don't make decisions this session that put the next legislature back underwater.
Thank you. Since my employer, Forum News Service, has a lot of properties, newspapers and TV stations or radio stations that have oil going through their communities, either by truck or by rail, I'd like to ask you right off the bat what you think the state should do, if anything, to improve rail safety, truck safety, that type of thing, especially when it comes to crude oil. And anybody can answer that first, but I'd like everybody to answer.
Well, so I can go first. You know, a lot of the regulation of the railroads, in particular, at the federal level. But so it seems to me the place that the state can step in is making sure that we are prepared to respond adequately if an unfortunate event, a derailment or something, were to happen. And Representative Hornstein and Senator Dibble have a proposal that's looking at that, because, you know, the public safety folks in a small community or a large community aren't necessarily equipped to address that. So to the extent that the state can help with funding and some other resources to make sure that if an event were to happen, we would be able to step up and respond to that, that would be the direction that I think the state could take this year.
Okay. Senator Bakk, you want to go?
Well, there's Canadian National Railroad goes right through the small town that I live in, and I have on more than one occasion seen cars that came off the tracks, and that's a real concern. It's a concern before we had oil. There's lots of other hazardous chemicals that are currently being transported, and I guess I look forward to whoever has a legislative proposal taking that through the process and making sure that the state does what it can in its limited way, because most of these things happen at the local level, and it's the local officials that respond initially, making sure that if there are weaknesses in that system, we do what we can to shore it up.
You don't have any specific ideas on that? Senator Hann?
Well, I agree with my colleagues. I think that you need to do whatever we can to make sure we have a safe transportation system, and it is a concern. But I think that generally part of the problem is that we've refused to permit pipeline carrying oil to the extent that is needed. And so we've driven a lot of that capacity over to the rail lines, and to whatever extent that's a problem, I think we should be looking at pipelines as a viable way to transport petroleum products, and we just really haven't done that, and that's maybe more of a federal issue than otherwise. But I think that is part of the issue here, is that we've got a lot of oil being transported in the rail system. It doesn't need to be, except we don't have the capacity.
Representative Daudt?
I would agree. I think that, the reason we're seeing more and more of the crude traveling on the rails is we don't have the capacity in the pipelines or the pipelines aren't getting approved that would take that crude off of the rails. And I think that's part of the reason we had such a spike in propane this winter, and I know that hurt many Minnesota families. I think that's a long-term solution that can help that as well, is get these pipelines moving. As far as your specific question about the safety, I think that the safety record is pretty darn good, but I think we need to make sure that we are ready in the event that, and it's not just crude oil, but any of the chemicals that are transported on the rails, we need to make sure that our people, our emergency responders, are ready to respond in that incident. So.
And as a follow-up, Speaker mentioned the Hornstein-Dibble proposal. Of course, that includes a tax on all crude oil going through the state. Do you support that? You brought up, Speaker.
Right. Well, as we talked about last week, I hope that we can find a different revenue source, and maybe with the budget surplus, that is a possibility to create the fund that they're looking at creating.
Anybody else? Do you support taxes, Senator Hann?
I support that taxes are the thing that we use to finance government. I don't believe we need to have a petroleum tax. I just think that is not worth doing.
Does anybody support it? I don't see Senator Bakk nodding or shaking his head. Where do you stand on that?
The Transportation Committee is probably going to pass something. It'll end up in this room in front of the Tax Committee, and the Tax Committee will decide.
And will you have any influence into that?
Right.
And how would you want to influence it?
It's a pretty comprehensive proposal, I think, that they're working on. And I don't want to speak for the governor, but I think the governor, in the conversations I've had with him, has been a little reluctant to take on new transportation revenue this session.
It's open for anybody else.
Senator Bakk, you're the only leader sitting at the table who didn't make tax reductions of some sort of priority. Where do you stand on the B2B taxes and conformity and those issues that the governor said he would support if the budget surplus is as projected now?
Well, I think it totally depends on what the February forecast shows. But, I am the leader that was a member of the legislature in the 90s. And, matter of fact, I remember we added up one time, my first 7 years in the legislature, we gave back $10 billion. And year after year, the new revenue forecast would come in, we'd cut taxes, the next revenue forecast would show more money, and we'd cut again, and the next one would show more money, and we'd cut again. And the final result of it was and much of this was under the Ventura administration. And in 2001, that mammoth tax bill we passed with the Jesse checks in it and the school takeover, getting rid of the general education levy, plunged us into deficit management for almost a decade. And so I am a bit reluctant, not only on cutting taxes, but on additional new spending measures that have tails in the next biennium. I do plan on being the leader this time next year, sitting in front of you talking about putting a new 2-year budget together. And we are only one revenue forecast with our head above water after a dozen years of problems. And I think to immediately run off and please everybody, I got an email this weekend, early childhood advocates want $50 million. This is not a budget year. And to do things, remember now, those tax cuts or spending that we propose to do this year are going to cost twice as much in the next biennium, because it's going to be 2 years of the biennium, not one. So it's very easy to vote for things and just hand off the ramifications of it to the next legislature, but I am the next legislature. The Senate is. And we don't want to run the risk. This economic recovery still seems pretty fragile to me. Small little changes in GDP growth have huge impacts on state revenue. So I'm going to continue to be very cautious until I see the February forecast numbers.
Speaker Thissen, do you think the state can afford a tax cut?
Well, again, if the budget revenue, I do, if the budget revenue holds up the way it is, but we will have to wait and see what the February forecast is. Of course, if that declines or expands, that changes the discussion somewhat. I would also note, though, that because of the budget work that we've done and because we have a growing economy, we do have a $2.2 billion budget surplus in the next biennium. So we do have some cushion already built into our structural budget as we look out to the next biennium.
Minority leaders?
Are you asking whether I think that we could return the business-to-business taxes? Is that what the question is? Yes, I think we can.
And conformity as well. Do both of them?
Well, I think so. To me, the likelihood of the budget forecast changing remarkably from what we saw in November is probably not great. They usually are pretty close. I think that there is sufficient revenue that you could do that without throwing your budget into disarray. But really the fundamental question here is, and I think that there's been very little talk about managing the spending side. And when you have 10% growth in spending, as we saw in the budget that we passed last year, you cannot sustain that with any reasonable form of taxation, in my opinion. You can't do it. We should be looking at how do we have a spending structure in this state that is more in line with what the economic growth is of the state. And we haven't done that. We haven't done that for years and years and years. And so part of the boom and bust cycle, so-called, of deficits and surpluses is related to the fact that our spending has been so erratic and so excessive. We need to get a handle on that. We need to have a structure in the budget that doesn't put us into spending decisions that are raising our spending by 10, 12, 15% every time we do a budget. That's just not doable.
Representative Daudt?
Sure. And I agree with Senator Hann. I certainly respect Senator Bakk, but it wasn't raising taxes that got us out of this situation. The economy was recovering. The Republican budget from the previous biennium did not raise taxes. We balanced the budget without raising taxes, and that basically righted Minnesota's economy and got us out of this budget situation where we had deficits. So the taxes weren't the answer in this situation, and I think that the case we were making at the time was we don't need this. We could have spent $1 billion more this biennium than last without raising one penny of taxes. And that shows you that taxes weren't the answer to the problem.
Can I take the bait?
Sure.
It's not as though we didn't get something for the spending that we did. And one of the areas in the budget that I have becoming increasingly concerned with is the cost of higher education. And if our Minnesota business infrastructure is going to be successful going forward, and Governor Plenty used to say it, we're never going to be the cheapest, so you better be the best. And if our businesses are going to compete going forward, they are going to have the most skilled, talented workforce that this state can provide. And that is one of the roles of state government, is to try and do that upfront training and skill enhancement for Minnesota's workers so that when they're done with their whatever kind of post-high school education they're going to have, they're prepared to be productive employees of our business community. And that is an important state investment. And I do think that's what last session was about, and I think that's where we have taken a different fork in the road than Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, they are cutting K-12 and higher education. In Minnesota, we're putting money in. We funded all-day kindergarten. We put huge new money onto the K-12 formula. We put enough money into higher education that we got a tuition freeze out of the University of Minnesota and out of Minskew. Those are smart investments. To say that we somehow just squandered the money, I don't think is accurate. Remember, the first $600 million that we raised had to fill the deficit that we were facing, that was handed off to the Speaker and I after the November election. The first thing we had to do was fill a $600 million hole. And then we went to invest in the things we think that Minnesota is going to make Minnesota prosper. Investments in early childhood, all-day kindergarten, K-12, higher education, and being a stronger partner with our local units of government. We restored that partnership at the local level with not only with our school districts, but with our cities and counties where most services get delivered. And the state needs to be a strong partner there. This notion that we can just demonize local government, that they somehow are the problem, when that's where most services are actually performed. I'm proud of the fact we've restored that partnership with our local governments and schools.
Can I take the bait? Part of the challenge here is we equate spending with accomplishing a goal. And with higher ed, for example, and I've had this conversation with President Kaler and others, the inflation growth of cost in higher education is the highest of anything we do. We talk a lot about health care and how the inflation costs are making health care unaffordable for people. We've got to figure out how to do that. Higher education is worse than that. And what do? We come to the legislature and say, well, the taxpayers should pay more. I asked President Kaler, and I think every operator of a higher education institution ought to answer this. Why is it that today ordinary people, middle-class people, cannot afford higher education? It used to be affordable. What has happened in the cost structure of higher education to make it unaffordable to the average American, average Minnesotan today? We should be asking that question rather than saying, well, okay, your costs have gone up so high that nobody can afford it, so we'll come to the legislature and ask for more money so we can afford to keep going. There needs to be more questions asked on the cost side of this thing. And just spending more money, which is what the Democrats did in their budget, doesn't solve that problem. And that's the thing we need to get at.
Anybody else want a second chance?
I'll jump in. I know in other briefings, some of you have mentioned the 5% campaign for long-term care as being a kind of a top 3 priority. Was that left off the list? Has that dropped below top 3, or is that number 4 right now? Where is that in a priority?
Well, I can answer that. I don't know if it's the top 3, but it is a priority, and I think it's a priority that is broadly shared. I think when Representative Abler and I were chairs of the committees a couple of years ago, we talked about this. We couldn't afford to do the things that we thought we needed to do, but we expected to do them in the next budget. For whatever reason, that didn't happen last year. So we think it's a fair exercise to find a way to support the people that are providing care to the disabled folks in the community, and I think there's broad support in our caucus for it.
And broad support in all the caucuses?
I can't speak to whether the 5% will be available. I mean, that will be determined by a revenue forecast. But, I do think there is a serious cost issue in our long-term care facilities. We are going to raise the minimum wage, and it is going to have an impact on their labor costs, some potentially on turnover of employees and additional training costs. So I think kind of in conjunction, we know they're going to increase their costs. They have no elasticity in their revenue. They just can't go out and raise revenue like a retail type establishment can. I think we have some obligation to recognize that and put some additional money in to mitigate some of the additional labor costs that the state is going to impose upon them.
House leaders?
Same as what Tom said. I think my caucus is use this favorably. I think they understand there's an issue and would like to see this 5% campaign successful.
So this is an issue Democrats and Republicans all want to spend money on together?
Yes.
Right? Okay.
My second comment is, I'm going to put money into long-term care before I put money into tax relief.
Okay.
I'd like to jump in and talk about bonding. May we do that, Don?
Go right ahead.
I remember we used to call the even year session the bonding session, and I think it was on some priorities, but Republican leaders, I don't see that was among your top 3 priorities, so maybe I'd like to start with Representative Daudt and Senator Hann. Please describe what your caucus is looking for in a bonding bill, and particularly talk about some of those backlog projects. I'm thinking now about civic centers in Rochester and St. Cloud and Mankato, been in the queue for a long time and met considerable resistance from your caucuses. What's your bonding bill look like? Maybe Representative Daudt can start.
I think my caucus is looking for a reasonable-sized bonding bill, and I think we're looking for something that is, has a priority on infrastructure, whether it be transportation infrastructure, maybe HEAPR projects in our higher education facilities, but really, I think, heavy on infrastructure type stuff. If we're getting a backlog and not taking care of the infrastructure we have now, we probably should do that before we worry about taking on new construction projects.
Before we go on, what's a reasonable-sized bonding bill?
I think, just personally, I think my caucus would like to be at or below the biennial average, which I think is right around $1 billion for the last maybe 10 years. That's kind of been the average, I think.
When all of you answer that, give us that figure you could live with. Go ahead, Senator.
Well, I think we did talk about this a little bit at the end of last session, and I think there is, at least as I understand, an agreement that the 2-year bonding limit would be $1 billion. We did spend some in the last session to do some renovation, continue the renovation on the Capitol. So whatever is left over in the billion, I think it's $840 million or something of that nature. That to me is the cap, and I know it's always a challenge of what fits into that cap. What are you going to do? And there, on our side, we would prefer that the projects be infrastructure, statewide, regional importance. Whether it's transportation or some of the things with the higher ed institutions. We want to see these things be, I think, broadly supported.
Let me press back on those civic centers. Why is that not considered civic infrastructure, to have in regional centers large buildings able to host business meetings, among other things?
Well, and I'm not going to say that they're not. I'm not. I think that we have members in our caucus, as you know, who support those things. And part of the effort to put together a bonding bill is to find things in the package that can be broadly supported. So we're going to have conversations about that in our caucus, but we think that the total number has to be under that limit, and what you can fit into that, I think that's where you have to negotiate what goes into that.
DFL leaders care to comment about the size of the bonding bill and what ought to be in it?
Well, I think a bonding bill in the range that the Republican leaders are talking about is good target for us to head for. I would agree with what Senator Bakk said at the beginning, though, depending on the forecast, if there is an ability to pay cash for some projects, that may be part of the discussion as well.
And talk about what you'd want to pay cash for, Senator Bakk, the types of things.
The Capitol? I mean, we need about $126 million, an additional appropriation to finish the renovations on the Capitol. There's seems to be broad support for that. Seems like that could be something we could use cash for. I think there's pretty broad support for our transportation infrastructure. I can't give you a number, but it will depend on what's available in February. I would support a very robust transportation package that is general fund money. Whether we carry it in the bonding bill or in the supplemental budget bill, I don't have strong feelings about that, but it seems like the capital and transportation would be a good place to spend some one-time money.
You come with sound effects, Senator, with construction work in the background.
Right on cue.
Davis, that's the sound of people making money.
Yeah, that's right. I was going to say, Senator, would you, if you were to pay cash, would that be to reduce the size of the bonding bill or in addition to a bonding bill?
My hope is that it's to supplement what we think is around an $850 million bond.
So in addition to?
On a related note, this is for the House leaders here, what's going to happen with the legislative office building that the Senate Rules Committee has approved now? $63 million for an office building and $27 for parking facilities. What's going to happen with that, Speaker and then Leader?
Well, we're taking it up in the Rules Committee. We're having a hearing on it in the Rules Committee, I think, at the end of next week, to look at, to answer some of the questions I think that people have raised about it. And, the bottom line on this issue, to me, is this. We are broadly supportive of renovating this building, the Capitol, and I think the public is broadly supportive of renovating this building. As part of that, there is less space for senators' offices, and I don't think that there's any dispute about that, at least under the current configuration. So I think the question that is begged as a result is what do we do to find office space so the public can actually have access to their state senators? And one of the solutions, obviously, we passed $3 million last year to study a proposal to build a new legislative office building. Importantly, I would say, at least the parking aspects of that are not being paid by taxpayers. They're being paid for by the people that use those facilities. So those are actually not taxpayer dollars going to pay for the parking facilities, which has somehow gotten lost in the discussion, but I think it's an important point for all of you to understand as you're reporting on this issue. So that's one of the options. Another option is to see if we can lease space. Another option is to see if there's an agency building that we can renovate to move people elsewhere. But the bottom line is or we revisit this space, the Capitol space, and put Senate offices back in this Capitol space, which would leave less space for other public access and things like that. So to me, that's what the critical question is. We're going to try to look at and answer some of those questions at the hearing we have on this issue next week. At the end of next week, I think it's scheduled for the Rules Committee. But the question I would ask to the Republican leaders who have kind of raised this as a political issue is, what's your answer to where the senators ought to go? I think that's the question that needs to be asked.
Before we go on to somebody else, do you have a dollar limit, Speaker, that you would?
Well, we know what the proposal is now, and we're going to look at what other options might be considered. We're going to look at seeing if there's ways to save money on that building, and I don't have one because I don't have all the information yet.
Representative Daudt, do you agree 100% with that?
I eagerly anticipate a great debate at the hearing next week. So,
I would like the Republican leaders to answer the question of where they think senators ought to be housed if we don't build this new legislative office building, because that really is what the question is. And they haven't answered that yet.
Well, and I'm happy to talk about that. I think we're getting by just fine right now. And to
so
say
we don't
that,
renovate the Capitol.
No, we can
I thought
certainly
you wanted to do that.
We can certainly renovate the Capitol,
And
but
then where do the senators go?
Well,
what's your answer, Kurt?
I will give it to you if you just let me talk. I'm very happy to give it to you.
I
but
imagine you won't.
The interesting part is the design on the Senate on the Capitol right now is contingent or based on moving senators out of here. Did we ever look at a plan to keep them all in? And the answer to that is no.
That's not true.
Because we've always looked at what's going to happen when they move out. Or at least that's where we're at right now. Did we look at keeping them all in? Yes, we did. But we have moved to a place where the current plan is to move, I forget, 20 senators or something out of the Capitol. I know there's disagreement even between the DFL leaders here at this table about whether all the senators should be in or all the senators should be out. So, I'm interested to see how this thing happens. But you know what? The one group of people that's been left out of this discussion is the public. At least on the House side, we didn't have a single public hearing on this. In the Rules Committee will be the first one where the public can come in, at least on the House side. I'm not as familiar with what happened on the Senate side last session, but I know that this got stuck in Conference Committee in the dark of night in the last few hours of session, and the public got left out. And it hasn't been part of a larger discussion about all of our needs, including the state office building and what should happen with that space. So I look forward to a real discussion with the public included at a public hearing where we can discuss these issues.
This is a lot of fun watching representatives debate about senators, but maybe we should ask senators to debate this too. Senator Bakk?
Well, first, this wasn't a dark of night thing. This actually was in the tax bill that passed in April, and we adjourned like the 20th or 21st of May. It was on the Senate floor in this room in April. It was on the Senate floor in April. It was in the Conference Committee and discussed in this room in the daylight.
At least in this kind of light.
This is I think a little bit comes up. We could probably figure it out and turn our state capitol into a Senate office building with all the senators in it. But the public would lose significantly, and we would lose all the common areas for the public. We're only going to get one chance to renovate this capitol, maybe in a couple generations, and this is it. And the new plan for this capitol that opens up huge new areas to the public, additional room for the Historical Society to be able to stage their tours out of, there are huge benefits to the public with the plan that we're trying to move forward with on the renovations of the capitol. But you cannot move forward and renovate this Capitol and open it up for more public purpose and keep all of the Senate in the building. Just cannot be done. And I am open to suggestions. If people have an idea, if you want to build under the Capitol lawn so we can say we're not building a new building, I'm willing to work with you on that, but we've got to create additional square footage for the Senate, or the building is not going to function as the kind of public house going forward for the next generation or two, like I think most of us wanted to.
A couple of raised eyebrows, Senator Hann.
Well, I think we had a hearing in the Rules Committee, and some other concerns that we had were raised at that point. But I think that there hasn't been, I believe, a full hearing on this proposal. I think it was in the tax bill. Republicans tried to have that removed from the tax bill while it was in the committee, and we also tried to remove it on the floor. We don't think that was the right way to do this. We think it's appropriately a bonding project, should have gotten a broad bipartisan support as other bonding projects get. Didn't happen. So there is some, I think, problem with the process and problem with how this got put together and sort of taken a life of its own. But there are tenants in this building besides the Senate. But the Senate is the only tenant that is being asked to vacate. The Attorney General has got another office building. But they're getting more space in this plan, as I believe. The governor is going to get more space. The other tenants are going to get more space. But the Senate is being asked to build a new building. There's something wrong with that plan, in my opinion. I think if we want to preserve this as primarily an office building for the Senate, which it has been, you could do that. You'd have to ask maybe some sacrifices in some of the other tenants, but that I don't think was ever raised as a possibility. So we think that there are other options. I think that when you do the renovation and the kinds of things we have to do is going to put some constraint on the spaces. We understand that. But why the Senate is the only tenant that is being asked to move out and to give up space, to me, that doesn't seem right.
Other questions?
Can I just on that? I mean, sure. If some other tenant moves out, it still begs the same question. You need the space, right? So, I mean, that argument really doesn't hold water, because we'd have to find space for the governor or for the Attorney General. So I just don't know that argument holds up. I mean, the bottom line is, if we are going to do the Capitol the way that's being proposed, we have to come up with a solution to this problem.
So should the press corps come back to the Capitol?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's part of the plan.
I did see Senator Bakk saying
You're going to have more space than you have today. I do think having the Capitol accessible to the press corps is important. And frankly, you're in very substandard conditions right now. And if any of my constituents watching think, oh, what's that about? They ought to go down and try, and when we get Minnesota News Network up in International Falls on 104.1, and once in a while when I'm up at my cabin, I hear Bill Werner on there, and you know what I think? Wow, that is a little room that people were sitting in when they were taping that little piece with Bill Werner. Most people have bigger closets at home than we expect. Some of our staff people here that cover the Capitol, that disseminate the information of what's going on here, how government's connected to their lives, need to have better space than you have right now. And that's going to cost real money. But that doesn't mean we don't move forward with it. We're talking about an investment that's going to last for generations.
Now that we have that on the record, more questions? Don't be shy, reporters.
We get kids.
Well, I'll jump in on something that I think Senator Bakk was alluding to a moment ago, which is a concern that I think editorial writers love. And that's whether the state's reserves are adequate. I think when you're talking about budget stability, you're talking in part about a reserve fund that has not been increased since Arne Carlson was governor, and that has been widely described by economic advisors as about half the size that it ought to be. Does enlarging the reserve fit into anybody's priority? Maybe just go down the table and talk about that.
I don't necessarily think that we need to. I think that, in the past, and obviously it was before my time here, the day I was elected, there was zero in the reserves and zero in the cash flow account. So, so this kind of predates me a little bit. But I think in the past we've had trouble making decisions on, what the right course is, and we've, spent down reserves and spent out of the cash flow account, and we've borrowed money from schools, and frankly, I don't think any of those are real good solutions. And, if you ask me, I know that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle here are going to say that it's because, we haven't been able to raise the taxes that we want to. Well, you know what? I think that if you look at the situation the state's in today, it's not because we raised taxes, as I said earlier. It's because Republicans over the last 2 years, or previous biennium, made some of the difficult decisions to kind of correct some. And it's very easy if you look at the revenue versus the spending to see where the problem is. The problem's been on the spending side, not on the revenue side. So, and right now we don't have a problem with revenue, we have a problem with spending. And what we did this biennium is double down with $4 billion of additional spending, about a 10% increase, which Senator Hann already said is absolutely unsustainable. And all of this at a time, and now I hope I don't see anybody doing a victory lap about having a small surplus right now. That money belongs to the taxpayers. It's what it means is that we've overtaxed Minnesotans. And for us to do some celebratory dance that we've got extra money in the state's budget right now, when Minnesota families haven't seen that money in their pocketbooks or in their family budgets, I think is the ultimate arrogance. And what we need to do is make sure that we're watching out for those families first. I know everybody talks about the unemployment rate being low right now, which it is, because Minnesotans have a great work ethic. But when they lost their jobs, they took a job at a lower wage or at a lower skill level, and right now 49% of Minnesotans are underemployed. That's a big number. 49% of Minnesotans are underemployed. So what we need to do is give the money that we took from Minnesotans that we didn't need back to them. That's where it's going to make the biggest difference.
The rest of you leaders, don't be reserved.
Well, go ahead. All right. Well, I think we ought to give the money back. I think that the reserve debate, there may be an argument that it should be different than what we have. We have about, I think, in total $1 billion or so that we call reserves of various kinds. What I think that if you have a spending discipline like we talked about before, where you don't have spending that is outpacing the growth of the economy, I think the reserves are sufficient. I think if you say, well, we're going to anticipate spending a lot of money, a lot more than that, and so when you don't have a robust economy growing at a faster rate, then you're going to have more reserves to cover that. That, to me, is not good policy. What we really ought to be thinking about is what kind of spending growth can we sustain, and then what reserves are needed. And I would argue that they're adequate for that discipline if we were able to keep it today. So I think primarily we should be thinking about how to give the money back. I think the tax reductions, tax changes we talked about, business to business and so forth, that's a good way to start.
Senator Bakk, you were going to say something? Go ahead. Don't be shy.
Somebody can fact check me, please do. But I think the reserve is the same number that Rudy Perpich set it at in the 1980s. So as a percentage of the state budget, that ability to be able to use that reserve to cushion revenue shortfalls is significantly less than it was back in the 80s. And if we can't put money into the budget reserve and shore up the state's finances now, when we think we're going to have some, when are we ever going to do it? But Don, maybe we can make a deal here with my Republican friends. Maybe one of the things we should try and do, rather than deal with the new sales tax provisions, maybe one of the things we should look at is the June accelerated sales tax. And I think most viewers probably don't realize, but we ask businesses to remit the sales tax in June before they've even sold some of the products. We ask them to estimate how much they're going to sell in June and then remit it in the same month that they're going to make the sales. We ought to undo that. It's an important, it would be permanent going forward. It would be an important mechanism for a future legislature to have in the event that we have another significant recession. Those kind of accounting gimmicks like that, when times are good, it's time to pay those measures back. And the June accelerated sales tax, my predecessor in the Senate, Senator Doug Johnson's the one that originally did that decades ago when they had a revenue shortfall, and we've never, ever paid it back. We still ask businesses to pay their sales tax before they even sell the merchandise. That is, I think, as important as any other tax measures that we may consider.
Add it to the list.
Agreement?
I think if we focused on ways to return the surplus, so-called, to taxpayers in various forms of tax relief, some of which have been talked about here, that should be our top priority. And if that's one of them, I don't think you'll find resistance on our side to say we shouldn't include it if we can afford to do it. We think the top priority is the business-to-business taxes. We think the conformity on the income tax, maybe the gift tax. But I'd certainly say add it to the list. I think the surplus will be able to sustain that.
Have you two talked about this issue before now? The two of you with each other?
Not privately, but we've had this question come up in other forum.
Why don't you two sit down and come up with a list of things you agree on before the session starts?
I mentioned it last Friday for the first time publicly when the Twin West Chamber had us leaders over there. What's important about it is it's a future accounting measure that a future legislature will have at their disposal, much like paying back the school shift. Because, without a larger reserve, you have to have accounting measures at your disposal to be able to keep the state's budget in balance. And the default can't be to fall back and borrow from our kids and borrow from schools. There are other measures, triggers that are easier to pull than that one. And the good thing about that is it's not ongoing spending that has tails. It has a small cost in the next biennium, but not huge. So it's a good use of some one-time surplus money in that we don't overcommit in the next biennium.
How much money does that involve?
I don't know what the number is, but it's significantly over $100 million.
Over $100 million.
Bill has a question.
Yeah, yesterday in this room, the House and Senate tax committees had a joint hearing where they heard a pitch for significant increases in transportation funding, including a gas tax at the wholesale level and a sales tax increase in the metro area for transit. Where do you stand on transportation funding increases?
So, I think that the point that the folks are making, first of all, is that we do have a significant need in the state to address these issues. But as we look at that proposal and we look at how in the past we've moved forward on proposals like that, it clearly has been done bipartisanly. It's been done, and the one group that, maybe there's more groups missing, but one clear group that was missing from that coalition is the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce and the Minnesota Business Partnership, the business community in general. We're not at the table as part of that coalition. I think that that's a critical element if something's going to move forward on this topic. I do think that, again, depending on the forecast, we will have some opportunities with the bonding bill and perhaps with some cash to make some investments in transportation this year. I also think, though, that one of the questions that group raised is in the funding sources that they brought forward. And I think that there is a serious discussion we need to have at the legislature and as a public in Minnesota about what is actually the best way to fund transportation investments going into the future. Is the gas tax the best way, or is that a declining source of revenue that we should be thinking of alternatives? So I think there's a lot of discussion yet to be had around that proposal.
Senator Bakk?
Tax increases have to originate in the House.
Is that called passing the buck?
Good answer.
If they send us one, the Senate will consider it. We went out on a limb last year after a lot of debate in our caucus about whether we should try to address the transportation funding shortfall. And actually, contrary to my advice, I asked the caucus not vote for a gas tax because I knew it was going to be very problematic with the governor. They overrode me, and we went up to the floor, and we voted for a gas tax increase last year. And frankly, there may be some political repercussions about that in the 2016 election, but someone has to provide some leadership on this issue. It is a critical need going forward. If this state is going to continue to grow an economy, our transportation infrastructure is falling apart, and it's not going to fix itself. It's only going to get more expensive to fix. And I don't expect we're going to do it this year. I have asked the business community that after we get beyond this next election to get engaged in this, and let's see what kind of a transportation package we can put together in the 15 session. Because if we can't do it in 15, we're not going to do it in 16 because that's another election year. So if it's not done in 15, we're going to wait till 17 to have the conversation again. And in the meantime, there's just going to be that much additional lost productivity as our business community cannot move goods and services around the state. I think it's one of the most critical things that we're facing, but I also think it's unlikely we're going to address it this year.
Senator Daudt, do you think we need more transportation funding?
I would like to just respond a little bit to what the speaker talked about with the business community not being on board right now with some increases in transportation funding. And this predates me a little bit, but I have visited with the business community, and their position is that when they were on board the last time, I think it was 2008, when that bill passed, that part of the deal was that the state was supposed to find some efficiencies, and I think that number was as high as maybe 15% efficiencies on that additional money. And so their position is that the state hasn't lived up to its promise to find those efficiencies. And they believe, and frankly I think my caucus agrees with them, that the money's already in the system. We're just not using it as efficiently as we should be. And I know that some members of my caucus have cited recently studies that show the cost of building a road mile here in Minnesota versus some of the surrounding states, and I think the question does need to be asked: are we spending these dollars as efficiently as we can, and are we getting the most bang for the buck in our transportation dollars? And until we know that that's happening, I don't think we can go back to the well. I think there is also a reality of we're in an election year here, and so I just think the reality of, Democrats probably will likely have a headwind with some other liabilities, MNsure and some other things that are not super popular right now. Adding a tax on top of the $2.1 billion in taxes that they've already put in place probably won't help their efforts in 2014.
From a public attention standpoint, the last several sessions have had kind of many more high-profile, maybe explosive issues when it comes to stadium legislation or gay marriage or constitutional amendments, what have you. Should the public be expecting a more boring session, kind of low wattage this time around?
Yes.
Yes.
Is that wishful thinking?
Feel free to elaborate
Yes.
on why you think that might be.
I mean, from our caucus perspective, I think what we really want to do. I think 2013, whether you agreed with the direction things went or not, I don't think anybody can disagree that it was a very productive session and that a lot was accomplished. And I see this next legislative session really as just building on the work that we did last time. And focusing on the things that I believe we primarily prioritized last time, which is, growing Minnesota's middle class and making sure that they continue to have, people continue to have opportunities to succeed. And so that's where our focus is going to be this year on those kind of bread and butter issues. And it's also, we have fairly short deadlines, and so I think that will help keep people focused.
Do you anticipate any significant legislation related to the environment or to energy policy? Start with the speaker.
So, okay. I'm just trying to, I don't. I think there has been a discussion about a change to our recycling, and this is not the bottle bill, which we will not be taking up this year or ever, perhaps, but about our recycling. Pushing us farther along the road of making sure that our landfills aren't filling up. And Representative Hornstein has a bill around that seems to have actually pretty broad support with kind of all sectors. And so I think that's a positive thing to be looking at. I think on the legacy and the LCCMR front, it looks like that they've come up with a pretty solid proposal that has pretty broad support and worked out a lot of the issues that troubled us last year. So I think we'll be able to move forward relatively smoothly on that, including addressing some of the aquatic invasive species issues, which I know are important to a lot of folks around the state. So those are the two things that come to mind, but I imagine other people are going to prompt my memory around what other issues might come up on that.
What about mining while you're using the mic?
I don't anticipate there's going to be legislation one way or the other on mining this year.
Does that include frac sand mining?
Yes.
Okay, and just to follow up on that, to be clear, because the governor said he would support a ban in southeast Minnesota of silica sand mining, so any appetite, interest to take that up this session? No.
Senator
I
Bakk?
think we need to let what we passed last year work itself out.
Senator Bakk?
I think if there was going to be a moratorium, it probably would have happened last year. I think the legislation that we ultimately enacted last year provide some important oversight and some cooperation between the state agencies and local government officials. And I am not aware of any legislation that's pending on that subject, or on mining in general.
To Speaker Thissen and Majority Leader Bakk, what constitutional amendments do you expect your caucuses to consider, and what are most likely to be put on the ballot next year, if any?
I'll let you go first on that.
Well, I think anything we do, I kind of have a litmus test, in that it needs to be around good government. And there are two that come to mind, and I don't know if my caucus is interested in either one of them. But the first one is a bill that I'm actually an author of that we're going to hear in the State and Local Government Committee, I believe tentatively March 3rd. It requires a supermajority to put something on the ballot. And it's drafted as statutory, but my intent is to amend it to be a constitutional amendment. I believe we're going to have some bipartisan support for that in the Senate. I know there is a very similar bill to mine authored by one of the Republican freshman members. So we will move it to the Rules Committee, and then at some point have a conversation with the House whether it's something they're interested in putting on the ballot or not. I don't have a interest in just lobbing stuff over and having the House try to figure out what they're going to do with it. But the other one I think that merits some consideration is whether judges should stand for re-election or not, or should they go and have a peer review panel that actually determines whether they should be on the ballot or not. And if they pass that test, they wouldn't face the voters. I know I'm like most Minnesotans. I think I flip that ballot over and I see all those judge positions, and I don't know anything about it. And frankly, I can't, as a voter, make as good a decision, I don't think, as a peer review process could. Senator Rest, I believe, is the author of that bill. There again, I would characterize it as a good government provision. I do not have any idea what the level of support might be in our caucus on either one of them.
Speaker Thissen?
I mean, my kind of inclination is not to move on constitutional amendments, but to the extent that there is some action, I would concur with Senator Bakk that they ought to be focused on the function and improving on a good government approach to them. And I think the public would understand that is what a constitutional amendment is for.
How do you feel about the two amendments that Senator Bakk just mentioned?
Personally?
Yeah.
I mean, I personally support both ideas. I just don't know if this is the time to be doing it.
And Republicans...
Senator Hann, I think I saw you nodding your head in agreement a couple times with Senator Bakk.
Well, I think the point he was making, that there are Republicans I know in our caucus who have supported the idea of a higher threshold to put things on the ballot. And so I think there would be some interest in that. I don't know if there's enough, and I don't know what the votes are, and I don't know what the votes are on the Democrat side. But I'm not going to predict whether there will be any constitutional amendments, but I think that there are Republicans who've looked at that and who generally support the idea of having a higher threshold. On the judicial issue, really haven't had any discussion with our caucus members on that. That's probably a little bit more of a contentious issue, but if people want to have a debate about it, we'll certainly participate.
How far are you willing to compromise on the minimum wage increase, and what potential hurdles would get in the way of an agreement here? And how quickly do you want to try to act on that?
Well, I'll go first, and I know a lot has been written about the idea of 950, like that's where the whole conversation is. And there's much more to those two bills that were passed by the House and the Senate than purely the $9.50 number. There are a number of differences on agricultural overtime, on parental leave, on inflation, whether inflation should be in, on sleep time in residential group home facilities, and what is the dollar threshold that defines a small business, and what should the minimum wage be for people that work in small businesses. And I can just tell you personally, I'm concerned about the idea of $9.50 for small businesses on main streets in small towns. As these big box retailers move into smaller and smaller markets, it's getting more and more difficult for small mom-and-pop businesses on main streets to survive. And I think that is one of my major concerns, is that because we have a difference in what the definition of small business is and what should the minimum wage for them be. I think that's an important part of the conversation here, because, and I said it on the radio this morning, that we're going to have people rallying here and waving signs, and they've been contacting members, but they don't have to own the outcome. Legislators do. And I'm going to push a green button for a minimum wage bill that's going to raise a minimum wage. What I don't want is to find out that the nursing home in the city of Ely had to close, and those 31 families who now have their loved ones 46 miles away in Virginia, how they're impacted. And I mention them because I happen to know they only have 2 months of reserves left, and they were down to see me last week. And other unintended consequences, I don't even know for sure what they are. But I do think we will have to reconstitute a new conference committee, not repass the bills, but reconstitute under the rules, reconstitute a new conference committee. I think they're going to take a couple of hearings to hear from all of the stakeholders about what the potential impacts, the differences in the bills are, before we can have something, I think, ready to send up to the floor of the House and the Senate. Because I am going to own that green vote, and I don't want to have something happen that we hadn't vetted well enough. So,
Senator, did you say a couple of years?
No, a couple of conference committee meetings, a couple of hearings.
Hearings, thank you.
I'm just guessing, too. I don't know. They can meet as long as they want, I guess. I guess if they came in the morning and spent a day at it, maybe they could get through it. But there are a lot of stakeholders that are impacted by it. What I can tell you is the people that are coming here to advocate for a tip credit, it's not in either bill. And that is my position on the part of the Senate, is that will not be, because it's not in either bill, will not be in the conference committee report that comes up to the floor.
Senator, why go with the new conference committee?
That's what the joint rules on conference committees between the House and the Senate actually disband the conference committee once we adjourn.
We'll reappoint the same people, and at least in the House, I imagine. So
what are some of the things you can live with or without?
Well, I think,
minimum wage.
In answer to the question, I think it strikes me that there are some issues that we need to work out, but it shouldn't actually take long. And remember that these bills actually got heard in both bodies and had significant public testimony last year before they passed the respective houses. So I think that a lot of that public discussion is had. Clearly, we need the conference committee to reconstitute, but I don't. All the issues and working out these differences, that's what conference committees do, and I don't see any reason that we shouldn't be able to move pretty expeditiously on this bill and get it passed after working out, what are, legitimate public policy questions, and the conference committee is certainly equipped to do that. So I could see, so I hope that we're able to move it out in the first couple weeks of session.
But as leaders, the two of you Democrats there, what can you live with? What limit for what minimum wage or other things that have to be in or out of it for you to live with it as leaders of your caucuses?
I don't think we should negotiate the bill right now.
I don't think we will. And frankly, I could vote green for the House bill, personally. I mean, I have been a labor person all my life, and I realize that's the bill that labor wants. But I cannot tell you today that there will not be some unintended consequences on that I then will own. And I also am not going to speak for the rest of my caucus relative to things like what is the definition of a small business and annual revenue, and what should that number be, because this discussion is about much more than how it's been teed up. It's been teed up as about $9.50. It's about more than that.
We had, and I think Senator Bakk referenced this, we had the nursing home folks come in and they say, look, if you do that, if you raise that minimum wage too high, some of us are going to go out of business. We can't afford to do it because all our revenue comes from you and the feds. And so you're going to have to pay more money to us so we can pay the higher wages. And I get that. Makes sense. They depend on us for revenue. If we say you got to raise your wages, then we should pay them. But what about the small businesses that can't come here and say, pay our costs as well? Where do those costs come from? They come from consumers. They come out of the pockets of other employees. They come out of the costs of not hiring people. There will be a cost. If we went to federal conformity, which is $7.25, that's a 40% increase from the current state minimum wage. We think that that's something we could live with, it put us on par with our neighboring states. I think going to $9.50 an hour is, this is a party that says they're about jobs, creating jobs, and they're going to do something that's going to put a lot of people out of work and cost other people opportunities. I don't see that as a party of jobs.
Anything to add, Representative?
Sure. I think this is an area where I think we all agree that we'd like to see, lower and middle income Minnesotans making more money. But, the solution to that problem is to create more better paying opportunities for Minnesota families. And unfortunately, this solution will create better paying opportunities, but less of them. And unfortunately, it's simply just not fair to the people that are going to lose their jobs. And even the Congressional Budget Office says that that's going to happen if we do this. So I think what we need is a more comprehensive solution that works for all Minnesotans. More better paying opportunities. We need an environment here that attracts business creators and job creators into Minnesota to create those jobs. And unfortunately, the policies that are put forth with business-to-business taxes are sending the wrong message. So this is the wrong solution to the problem.
So So I mean, just on this whole debate, first of all, if you look at, we can talk about all the policies that have been adopted at one time or another. The bottom line fact is that unemployment is among the lowest in the country in Minnesota. Our job growth by Forbes and Wall Street Journal, again, right-wing think tanks, have ranked Minnesota's economy in the top 10 in terms of its economic growth, its jobs, its business friendliness, those types of things, because we have made investments historically in the kind of things that Tom was talking about at the beginning, investments in education, investments in job creation, investments all around the line. And so first of all, I think that the policies we've adopted, for all the doom and gloom that has been said about, our economy is going to collapse, businesses are going to flee, we certainly haven't seen that, right? In fact, it's going the other direction. In terms of the minimum wage, I think that there is debate around this issue. The CBO report made an estimate of 0 to 100 to 1 million jobs. At the $9 an hour, though, an increase to $9 an hour, it was 100,000 jobs at the most nationwide, which is much closer to the proposal that we're talking about here in Minnesota. More importantly, that same report, well, a couple things. A whole bunch of other economists, 600 of them, I think, including a number of Nobel Prize winners, and you all know this, but it's worth repeating because of what has been said, have said it doesn't have an impact on jobs. When we last raised the minimum wage here in Minnesota, when we last raised it at the federal level, you didn't see that impact on jobs going away. But what the CBO report also said, and which everybody seems to agree with, it actually increases economic activity in the nation and in the state where that goes into effect, because people that make that additional $1 or $2 are actually spending that in their communities. And that actually does create jobs. That's what Republicans would tell you. The more people are spending money in their communities, those businesses are thriving, and it's going to create more jobs. So at the end of the day, I think that what we ought to do is be moving in a direction where we're actually making people more self-sufficient. And that's what a minimum wage increase is all about. And I look forward to having the discussion on the floor and then going out to the people of Minnesota and talking about that.
If we're not going to negotiate the minimum wage here, let's move on to another question.
Let me jump in.
We're running low on time. Let's move on.
The one thing that nobody still has talked about but me is the underemployment. And this is a huge deal. I mean, I know that increasing the minimum wage sounds great, but unfortunately, this is the solution that's going to unemploy the underemployed. And what are we going to do to get back to where we need to provide the opportunities that Minnesota families want and need? And that's the answer.
What are we going to do?
Repeal the business-to-business. So let's create an environment here where job creators can thrive. I've already talked about it.
We've been paying underemployed people
Don, what
for years and years.
What hasn't been said about the report from the Congressional Budget Office was they estimated that 900,000 people will be lifted out of poverty. That is not insignificant. That is a huge improvement in I think, for the state, in that we would have fewer people dependent on state services. And it just seems to me that if somebody sets an alarm clock, gets up, packs a lunch bucket, goes to work, works 40 hours a week, they shouldn't live in poverty. And I don't think any of us should want them to do that. People are all working hard, trying to provide for the needs of their family, and still are dependent on government help.
Let's move on to Doug.
Can I just say it'd be nice if the floor debate on this bill was like about this, and then we'd be done?
Then we could vote.
You have that power, Speaker. Doug, did you have something?
Mr. Speaker, I had the sense that Senator Bakk was talking about an increase with a lot of asterisks, with a lot of little decorations hanging from the tree. Minimum wage has, other than in Minnesota, has typically been a fairly simple thing. You work, you get this amount of pay. It sounds like we're talking about a much more complex system of different sorts of, but maybe a little less in this situation.
No, the minimum wage, I think, is the same as it would be in other states. The bill that the House passed, and I think there's provisions in the Senate that are like that too, also had conformity with some wage rules and some other things around the 40-hour work week and that kind of thing. So there's additional pieces that included in the minimum wage bill. I think that's what Senator Bakk was referring to.
Okay, reporters, we're running out of time. Don't be shy. Go ahead, Bill.
One of the most difficult problems you face is what to do about sex offenders. And if you don't do something soon, it sounds like the federal courts probably will. What are the chances that you will do something on that issue this session?
Well, I think we're, first of all, I think in part to make progress, we are looking at what the federal court is going to do. I think there is a fundamental concern among some parties that are, concern's not the right word, but a question about whether our system is actually unconstitutional. And until we kind of get that piece resolved, it's hard to move forward in a bipartisan way to address this issue. And to me, that's what we need to do. There are a bipartisan group of legislators working, not as we speak, but right now, leading up to session, on what a proposal could look like. And to the extent that the court makes its ruling and we have to address certain things within that system, my hope is that we're going to be ready to go and be able to pass that in a responsible way that addresses public safety concerns around this, which are certainly legitimate, but that also kind of have the kind of broad support we need to move forward on something like that.
Anybody else on that?
Well, just that I agree. I think this is an issue that you need to have bipartisan support on, and there have been in the past, for going back 2 or 3 years at least, that I recall, groups of Republicans and Democrats, at least in the Senate, who've been working on this issue, trying to find a way to move forward. We do have one of the more costly and one of the largest populations of sex offenders in the country, and there are legitimate questions being raised that are constitutional. We all think that we don't want the courts to come in and dictate a solution. So I think it may be possible to make a step this year. I don't know. We'll find out. We've got a group of people that are looking at these things and trying to see if they can come up with something that would be relatively modest in its scope, but it would at least send the signal that we're trying to make some forward progress.
Is it better to let the federal judge go ahead and hand down a ruling to kind of force the issue? I'm hearing hesitation.
Not in my opinion. I just think it is a responsibility of the legislature to pass the laws, not courts. And to me, it's always a bad thing when the courts come in and say, "Here's your law." So,
Well, I think the federal courts may rule before session even convenes. And I do want to publicly thank Senator Hann. We met a couple times on this subject last session, along with Senator Limmer, who had been the previous Judiciary Chair in the biennium before, and actually bipartisanly passed some legislation that we modeled after the recommendations of the task force that had been working on this issue, and we did it with a strong bipartisan support, and that takes a lot of courage. I mean, that potentially writes some campaign literature for people, but in the Senate, at least, we were able to rise above the partisan politics and made our best effort to try and preempt the federal courts. But I think right now it might be too late.
Does anyone anticipate any scenario in which the stadium comes back before you in terms of funding or oversight or regulation or anything?
Yes.
We expound on that.
There may be some things we might need to consider if Minnesota's going to land a Super Bowl. There are some provisions that the NFL expects host states to do as part of the Super Bowl package. I believe the NFL is going to pick the successful city in May. So the reason I can't absolutely answer no is I don't know if the NFL is actually going to ask us to pass some legislation that are related to what their expectations are relative to Super Bowl. And I do think it's going to take some legislation. I just don't know it'll have to be done before they actually pick the city, or if they're willing to just trust us that we're willing to do it after we've been picked.
You're talking about things that aren't currently funded as part of the law?
Talking about tax provisions like waiving income tax or sales tax provisions on people that come here to play or visit. There's a basket of things that the NFL really requires states to do in order to host a Super Bowl, and it would be consistent with what other states have done. And it will require legislation. I just don't know if it's going to have to be done prior to being picked as the host city, or if they're willing to let us do it after. But the Super Bowl wouldn't be until 2008.
Proving once again that businesses don't care about taxes when they make decisions. So just want to point that out.
Is one of those things being able to buy your booze on Super Bowl Sunday or any other Sundays? And as long as we're on that topic, could you guys address whether that thing will get a vote this year?
I have no doubt it will get a vote this year because it gets a vote every year. Sunday sales, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Is it going to pass?
You know, it got 20 votes last year, so that's a lot of votes to turn around.
What about MNsure? It didn't exactly have the smoothest of launches. Are there any issues that the legislature could or should circle back around and address this session?
Not that I anticipate right now, but who knows as we move through this session. I mean, it did have a rocky launch. I think that they are actually making progress, though, in improving things, and and I would say on that front, in the bill that was passed, there was actually significant legislative and other oversight put into the bill, and so that function of the legislature, I think, will, continue to function, or function perhaps maybe even take more steps in that regard. And I would say a lot of those were actually Republican amendments that the House did adopt as it came through the process.
Just to clarify that, do you think the legislature is not doing a good job of oversight?
No, I do think that they will, but I think that would be more the function as we go forward as well, as opposed to taking up a bill this year.
I know Senator Hann wanted to talk about this, but we only have 10 minutes left, so cut down your half-hour speech.
Well, we of course have issues with this whole policy, but we think there are things in the short term that we should look at. We do think there are issues with the governing structure of MNsure. We are not convinced that there is sufficient oversight in the part of the legislature. We're not sure that the powers that have been granted the board are appropriate, and the kind of oversight that has been given, or lack of that, given to the board is appropriate. We're concerned about things like the active purchasing authority that they were given as a board. We don't think that you want to even limit the choices that are available right now even further by enacting that. So we think there are things in the short term that we ought to at least look at. We ought to have a bill. We ought to talk about this. We ought to maybe vote on it. But even beyond that, I think the status of this federally, I heard recently that President Obama once again has unilaterally set aside provisions of the bill. I think it's about 24 times he's done that. I'm not sure what the status of the law is when a president can come along and say, oh, well, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do that, and the Congress hasn't even acted on it. I think that we should have a governor, and I hope Governor Dayton will do it, say let's hold off on going down this path until it is clear what the harm or the benefit to the people is of the state. We've had a lot of people lose their insurance and have to go to different choices that they wouldn't have done otherwise. It's not clear. I don't think there's been a single person insured under the MNsure program that wasn't already insured in this state. There are a lot of things that the federal law is asking us to do that we were doing, I think, before adequately, like making sure that pre-existing conditions didn't outrule your opportunity to get insurance. So I think that this has been a mess, and we should be cautious about it. We are responsible for the laws in this state. And to me, one of the biggest problems is that we've given that up to the federal government, and we ought to do things to try to rescind that and get control of this so that we are in charge of this. And I think we ought to consider that in the legislature this year.
Reporters, we have very little time left.
One last one.
Well, Bill has the last one, but you
Bill
have the
gets
next
the last
last
one.
one.
Have the next last. Last session, $485 million for education. Yet school advocates are again talking about more money for things like facilities or teacher evaluations, and there's still a pretty long list out there. Early education, I think you mentioned earlier, preschool. Is there more money for education with the surplus?
I think again that depends on what the size of the surplus is. I do think that the one thing that I think has been most clear to me is whether we need to fund additional money for to let the teacher evaluation process work the way it's supposed to work. And that's something that we've heard about and I think is a legitimate kind of short session kind of discussion to have. And, to the extent that there is opportunity to, one of the concerns I have in the early childhood, what we did with early childhood last year is put the $5,000 cap in place. That was not the House position. I don't even think it was necessarily the Senate position, but nonetheless became law. And so to the extent we can lift that and maybe provide some more funding there to allow more people to access those scholarships, I think they've been fairly successful. It's something worth considering. I would not say we should do anywhere near the $50 million, though, that was mentioned, a much smaller amount than that.
Anything else on that? Education funding? Then we're going to go to the last question from the Dean of the it's not the Capitol Press Corps anymore. It's the Centennial Building Press Corps. Bill.
One of Governor Dayton's priorities for the session, he says, is the unsession, to undo a lot of red tape, to make government work faster, better, cheaper, and so on. None of you have even mentioned that. Isn't that a priority for you?
I actually mentioned it in my very first answer. I said, my priorities were things that I think fit right in line with the unsession, which is fix some of the mistakes that were made last session. And so far, the unsession has been, and I don't mean this to be disparaging of anybody, but so far they haven't earned my confidence that the unsession is anything real. It seems to be at this point just a good talking point. And I guess maybe I'll offer that as a challenge to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Let's not just talk about it, let's do it. And I'm not talking about going through the statute books to find a committee that's still in statute that hasn't met for 15 years. Let's do some real stuff. And I think we've got a good opportunity. And you know what? I think people at home get frustrated with what we do in St. Paul because it's always this partisan bickering. And here's a good opportunity for us to work together to find some things to kind of get out of statute and repeal, and let's make government work more efficiently and more effectively for the people that we serve.
Have you, before you go, Representative Daudt, have you given your colleagues a specific list of things to undo?
All of my committee leads have been participating in meetings, and we have a pretty significant participation in this process. And I think that we're more than happy to certainly step up and provide ideas, and paramount of which would be those tax increases that were put in place last session. I mean, if we're going to talk about unsession, let's do some of the things that are going to hurt Minnesota's economy, and not just go back and find language that's outdated that nobody's even paid attention to for 15 years. To me, that's just lip service. And I know, I take them at their word that they really meant that when they wanted to have an unsession that they meant it. Well, let's do it. Let's do it together.
Speaker?
So, I appreciate and I do think this should be something that should be bipartisan as we move forward. And I think there is an advantage to, a number of the issues that have come forward in terms of repealing old language. And one thing it does allow state works of people delivering services to focus on the services that people really need. I also think, that the fact that we are repealing these 40 boards out of 160 boards that are out there, many of them, some of them are old and haven't been used in a while. Some of them are active but aren't serving their function anymore, and we are repealing those. And I would contrast that 25% cut with what happened with the Sunset Commission, which cut zero. So at least we're delivering something, I suppose, on the unsession. But more than that, I think there are some substantive things that we can work on around this. I think that there's going to be some work done to try to correlate the teacher evaluation and QComp statutes to make them work more effectively together. I think that there's going to be some work around paperwork and special education that I think would have bipartisan support to allow us to ease the burden on folks providing those special education services and getting more time spent with students. I think that's, again, something we can support and would fit in with the idea of making government work better. I think that there's some rulemaking changes that we can make for certain types of rules that would allow the public process to happen while a rule is being articulated, so that you don't kind of have as long a period to do rulemaking on things that are perhaps less controversial. So I think we actually are going to have some substantive changes that we can make, and I'd love to hear. I think this is a chance for all kinds of ideas to come forward. What I hope it doesn't turn into, I hope, though, that as we talk about the unsession, not everything fits into that bucket, because you can make anything into an unsession idea, right? I hope that the bipartisan support for it just isn't taking your pet kind of policy projects and putting them in an unsession bucket, but actually looking at how do we make government work better and take that charge seriously, as well as some of the other things which I think we will have support, like repealing some of these taxes.
Senator Bakk?
Well, I don't remember that the unsession was my initiative, but what I did communicate to the governor back in November, and because he had all of his state departments looking through what they do and what statutory language are in their agency's domain, what I suggested to him in November is that whatever those agencies are going to do, they get it ready to go, so that it's ready to be introduced the first day of session, knowing this was going to be a relatively short session. I think the challenge is, are we really, if we can find some real things to do, are we willing to carry them through to the goal line? Because I think there is significant risk that unsessioned bills get brought to the floor in different jurisdictions, and somehow things are germane to them. And bipartisanly, bills get amended on the floor. And that really doesn't live up to, I think, the intent when these here's my example. So the DNR's got a proposal of a bunch of redundant stuff they don't need in law anymore, and there's something germane to guns in there. And something comes to the floor, and all of a sudden the bipartisan effort on unsession is subject to all kinds of amendments that essentially end up torpedoing the good work that the agencies and members of the legislature are going to have done. So that would be my request, I guess, is if we're going to go down this road and the State Departments have ideas about where we can make government function better, eliminate redundant things, that when we get that out of committee, we get it to the floor, we don't turn it into a Christmas tree because other things are somehow germane to it. I think that is a significant risk, that potentially nothing gets done in some areas of the state budget because somebody wants to play politics when they get to the floor. And the governor did commit that he'd have all the bills ready by the first day of session.
Yes, I have the last word on this, but to me, the one remarkable thing about the governor's proposal is that he hasn't recommended one single thing that fits into his bucket of what we should undo. You know, typically, my experience has been governors who propose these things, you know, whatever they reform or whatever, they have an idea in mind of what they want to do. And the governor hasn't come up with a single thing that he said, this should be our #1 target to fix. He hasn't said that. And I think that's remarkable. So I think the things that have been talked about are good things, and they have bipartisan support. But there are other things we could do, and again, I'll be repetitious here, but I think we ought to undo those business-to-business taxes. I think there is bipartisan support for it. I think the governor supports it. I think it would send a huge message to our economy and our businesses. But there are other things. We passed something last year, the World's Best Workforce Act. It didn't get a lot of attention in the Senate that I recall. Came out of the House. I've been around the state in the interim. I've talked to dozens of school districts, and every one of them has brought this up without my even asking. I didn't even know what it was at first. And they said, what did you guys do that for? It's just burdensome, paperwork, costly, intrusive. We're doing this stuff already, but now we got a whole bunch of other stuff we got to comply with. And if we don't do it exactly the right way, then the State Department comes in and takes over 2% of our operating budget. What's up with that? Well, we ought to undo that thing.
You know what? And what's up
Why
with
shouldn't
that?
we do it?
What's up with that is actually living up to what I think Republicans as well as Democrats want to do. If your school district, those local school districts, aren't actually making progress on closing the achievement gap and on getting people college and career ready, they ought to have some consequences because the state puts a lot of money into those school districts. And so I don't see what anybody's objection to kind of living up to that standard would be. I'm really surprised actually that Senator Hann is actually challenging the idea that we ought to have consequences when school districts actually don't live up to the investment that we're putting into them. But I would say, I would commit, as Senator Bakk said, that as these unsessioned bills come to the floor, that we won't offer any amendments on the Democratic side if the Republicans would commit in a bipartisan fashion to not bring up any amendments on the Republican side, because I think we'd actually get a lot more work done that way, just on these particular bills.
Bill, that was a great way to end this
let's
session.
get an answer on that? That would make news for you.
I don't think we want to negotiate bills in front of the whole press corps, do we? We have that standard set already, so we'll wait till we see the bill.
Same thing, Representative.
I think in spirit, I don't necessarily have a problem with that, but unfortunately, games get played on both sides, and a bill that really isn't an unsession bill can come through. And I think in spirit, though, and I think the Speaker knows that when I say this, my word's good. If we're really making government more efficient, more effective, and it lives up to the theme of unsession, we're happy to run those bills through clean. There's a lot of bills that I'd love to see run through clean. The 5% campaign, I'd love to see that bill travel on its own, a full 5% with nothing else. But unfortunately, that bill will probably get attached to something else as some sort of political, vote bait, and force people to vote against something that they like. And unfortunately, that's just the game that happens here. But if I can get commitment from them that they're not going to play games, we won't either. I'm happy to commit that now.
This is a great example, this last question especially, of what these poor journalists around the table have to deal with every day we cover you folks. Trying to figure out what's true. Seriously, we appreciate you leaders coming down, taking this. One of you said, well, what can we talk about for an hour even? We've been at an hour and a half. And I still have lots of questions I'd love to ask you, but we have until May 19th to ask you these questions, so we'll continue with this exchange next few weeks and months. Thank you again. Thank you to the journalists. And special thank you to the Senate Sergeant-at-Arms Office and Senate Media Services for really doing all the work setting this up. And if you want to go watch yourself and see how you answered the questions, Senate Media Service will have this archived, so you can go back and watch this time and time again, because we will, so we can hold you to whatever you might have said today. Forum News Service thanks you, for coming, and we'll see you again next year. Well, we'll see you before. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
We'll go through next week.